Welcome to the Healthy and Wealthy Retirement, where your certified retirement counselor, Mark Struthers, takes a holistic approach to retirement, going beyond finances and embracing holistic well-being. This YouTube channel will address not just the financial part of retirement, but also the social, the physical, and the emotional parts of retirement. Everything you need for a healthier, a wealthier, and a happier retirement. Here is your host, Mark Struthers.
Hi, welcome to the Healthy and Wealthy Retirement. My name is Mark Struthers. Thank you for joining us. Don't forget to hit subscribe before you leave so you can have a healthier, a wealthier, and a happier retirement. Today we're talking about the 3-bucket strategy, or maybe the bucket strategy, in regards to retirement, allocation retirement funding. And I have to say, overall, I like the idea of a bucket strategy. The reason being, it helps clients with the mental accounting, it helps them handle risk, is the bottom line, as far as what risky assets are there for. And because the first 2 buckets are generally lower risk, it gives them comfort. It's comfort cash, although it's not all cash. It gives them comfort and allows them to be more comfortable with the 3rd bucket. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but there are 2 main types of bucket strategy. The first one is the most common one. It has to do more with time. And the second one has to do with types of retirement spending. We'll flash up at the screen what you often see is, say, a 50% equities, 50% cash or fixed income portfolio from a macro level. And maybe you'll have 10% in very lower risk assets, and we'll describe those a little bit more in a second. And then you might have some bond type moderate risk, light to moderate risk, and then riskier assets in the 3rd bucket. Now, there's lots of different versions of how people do this, but what you most commonly see is the first bucket has T-bills, and the T and I'm in favor, if you're doing the strategy, that you have maybe something other than T-bills. But the idea being that this bucket is kind of part emergency fund, and it's there to fund your spending for anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, usually no more than 3. So we'll say 1 to 3 years. But it's lower risk, and you can see why that would give folks a lot of comfort. They know that the next 3 years is paid for. I often will throw in, when something like this is used, I also use muni bonds, depending on the situation, especially if you're mixing in taxable accounts. That's part of the rub or the problem with the 3-bucket strategy. It gives clients a lot of comfort and it kind of simplifies things, but the actual execution is complicated because what account types? Do you have 3 different account types for each bucket? Do you have a bucket number 1? Does that include taxable, Roth, and traditional IRAs, 401ks? So that's where it can get more nuanced and can add complexity. It's not to say that it's not insurmountable, but that's something to consider. The main theme for bucket 1, if you're going to do this, is they should be low credit risk. So something like money market funds, if you're using muni bonds or other types of bonds, investment grade bonds, very high quality. So you don't have that credit risk. So there's not a lot of volatility. Also, they should be at least somewhat immune from rates rising. So shorter maturity, call it duration. So the idea that the overall duration of your bucket 1 is certainly no more than maybe 1 year. And you could certainly actually ladder. You can even ladder treasuries. You can ladder muni bonds. You could ladder things in that bucket, and we've done that as well, to where you have that set cash flows for your 6 months to 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. The biggest downside to bucket 1 is that inflation risk. Obviously, even if these aren't moving very much when rates rise, their purchasing power is being decreased. But the idea that you even have bucket 3 and maybe somewhat bucket 2 is for some inflation protection. Bucket 2 is the fixed income bucket. That one it's with longer duration, longer maturity, maybe even a little bit higher risk fixed income. And that's generally to fund years, say, 3 through 7. Most people, everyone does this a little bit differently, but usually you find it somewhere in there, that these are designed to, they're not going to do well during rising rates environments. And that's where you have to consider, how that might perform. But and a portion of this bucket ideally should probably go down if you have a rising rate environment. Hopefully, when I say active management, I don't mean you're buying and selling bonds, but this bucket, when rates were super low, you probably should have erred on the side of shorter maturity bonds 2 or 3 years ago. You never know for sure, and just like now, it's probably better to go back to erring on the side of longer duration bonds, because this bucket should act as a ballast during recessions and depressions. Traditionally, when you have recessions or depressions, that 10-year treasury, think of 10 to 20-year treasuries, generally go up. You certainly could mix in some things that have a little more credit risk, because in many ways that helps with an inflation protection because you're getting more yield. But it should be limited. I generally, if I'm including high yield junk bonds, lower investment grade, things that do go down in recession or depression, often not as much as equities, but do go down, that's where you might start crossing over into bucket 3, something that is more volatile. So bucket 2 can be nuanced as to how you put it together, but you don't want to, I don't think you want to have all longer maturity fixed income. And you don't necessarily have to have all U.S. Treasuries, but I think the core of it needs to have something like that. And even just depending on the yields and the shape of the yield curve, you certainly can even have like a barbell. But keep in mind, you also have very short maturity in your bucket 1. So bucket 2 is kind of like the ballast for a recession or depression. It provides usually a little more income because it has, most of the time you get more yield when you have longer duration assets, longer maturity assets. Although if the yield curve is inverted, like it has been, that's not the case. But it also is there more for a ballast for a recession and depression. You certainly have bucket 1 that can fund quite a bit. Obviously you're spending for the first 1 to 3 years. But again, this is for years 3 or 7, that it's not going to move very much. And even in our recent example, long maturity bonds haven't come back all the way, even on a total return basis. But if you had some moderate duration or lower duration bonds in there, they certainly have come back. And even some of that longer duration have come back. Again, we went through an unusual time, and this is where you do have to take care. Probably more care with this bucket than other buckets. Bucket 3 is the high risk bucket. It is for years 7 through 20, 7 through 30. This gives you the long-term inflation adjusted growth. This helps keep your purchasing power. It also helps plan for maybe a thing like a legacy, long-term care. And the reason this works for clients is because they can ignore that bucket. Hopefully they're ignoring out of understanding and not fear, but they can ignore it because they know they have bucket 1 and bucket 2. They know those buckets are going to get them through at least 5 to 8 years. Bucket 2 was challenging depending on how you had it managed post-COVID. But the third bucket, they can just let it ride. One big issue that you have with the bucket strategy, and I see it a lot with do-it-yourselfers, and I've seen this in real life, they will spend down bucket 1, then spend down bucket 2, and then all of a sudden they're deep into retirement, maybe 6 to 8, 7 to 10 years, and all they have is risky assets. And it's understandable if you're not familiar, if you're kind of going with what someone tells you. If someone says bucket 1's for 1 to 3 years, on the surface, you spend it down. And to some degree, depending on how you're going to operate it, you do. But obviously that for most people, that doesn't work. There are some cases where it might, it depends on Social Security and pensions, but ideally when you're getting into your 70s or even 80s, you don't want to have, most people don't want to have all equities. It's unusual. So what you find is the common practice is that if equities are up, you spend from bucket 3. If equities are down but bonds are up, you spend from bucket 2. If both are down, you spend from cash. And certainly even with COVID, because it kind of lasted, the higher rates and everything being, stocks and bonds both being down, only lasted, a couple of years? Again, the one rub you might have is if your maturity duration from bucket 2 was too long, some of those drop down 25, 30%, and it still hasn't come back all the way again. But if you had the equity portion, and you stayed with it, might have more than made up for it. The other type of bucket strategy, and it's really more two, or you often see it listed as two, and we'll flash a screen up here what it might look like, is where you have one bucket for core needs. It's needs versus wants, or essential spending, non-discretionary spending, and the other assets are for more the things that you maybe could do without. And the first bucket, if you will, is obviously very low risk, and maybe it doesn't have an inflation adjustment. But the other bucket might be higher risk assets that if you had to cut back on because of a down market or whatever the case may be, you could have that. When you see this bucket, the only thing I would, as a 2-bucket strategy, I think you actually probably need to throw in a third bucket being the emergency fund. That if they have an emergency fund, then maybe the bucket for the spending. You often see this strategy where someone might have Social Security as just covering core expenses, or they buy an income stream. A single premium immediate annuity is one that I'd like to say it's popular. It should be used more. During the COVID years where I had a little free time, I wrote a book, actually, it's right behind me, where I talk about the SPIA, and I don't call it the 2-bucket strategy, but I think something like this is a good idea, where you have core expenses paid for. There's a comfort there. Whether or not you pay for an additional inflation adjustment is a separate question. The other one that some people use this for is a GLWB, guaranteed lifetime withdrawal benefit annuity. People seem to be more comfortable with that. I got to admit, which I don't have an issue with. As many of you know, the times I have issues is where there's not an informed choice. The reason I became a fee-only advisor, I don't care for commission sales, is because a lot of times people are sold this product because the commissions are so large. And this, compared to the SPIA, is a one-time deal. That though that money's gone, which is part of the reason why the clients don't like it, and I understand why. And even though the GLWB, and I'll use Kitsis is a big name in the financial planning world. Even though GLB will most often give an inferior outcome because it's a floor with some upside. So you get a floor base of income, but you also have some upside. It's just that it's not. I've never seen a case where it's going to be as good as having the single premium annuity, and even with with or without inflation adjustment, and then you have assets invested in something that is lower fee, that is more flexible. And that's probably a conversation for a separate YouTube channel. With either one of the bucket strategies, the biggest issue, and I'll circle back to the first bucket strategy, is the issues with buying equities when they're down. When you look at simulations and the studies done around and just real life experience, when you talk about these bucket strategies, if you're not rebalancing from 50% equities, if equities shoot up and it goes up to 60%, you're not rebalancing, or vice versa. When equities are down, you're not selling off bonds to buy them, which you often don't see you don't see it as much as you should during the traditional bucket strategy. Because they're only accessing the buckets as needed, if you will. You often, and it's tough when when the market's down 30% to start buying equities. and I'll flash a chart up here. This is from Kitsis. I'm not going to publish all the assumptions around it. I think his name alone should tell you that this is a pretty solid study, and logically it makes sense. If you're not fully buying in equities when they are down, your long-term performance is going to suffer. You certainly have to give equities time to run. You certainly have to allow some of that momentum to happen because those are real things. But that being said, a total return approach with rebalancing is you're really never going to beat that over the long term. That's the most efficient way to have portfolios last. And it's really a balance between having the comfort of the buckets with the total return approach to make where the portfolio is as efficient as possible. And the emotional side is certainly as important, or at least close to it, as the number side, because what you find is if folks truly aren't comfortable, even the wealthy, I've seen folks who their assets versus their spending is so favorable to them that they shouldn't have anything to worry about. But unless they kind of have those buckets segmented, they can't sleep at night, and they're apt to do something that harms them in the long term. Probably the best scenario, I think, if you can do it, is to maybe do a total return with rebalance, or operate what is I'll use the word pseudo bucket strategy, where you're rebalancing in and out of these accounts to where it's a total return, but you're calling it a bucket strategy, and then you're presenting it to yourself or to the client as being a bucket strategy, to where you're just segmenting them. You're letting them know, yep, we're always going to have 1 to 3 years of income, not fully adjusted for inflation, but we're going to have those there. But we will have the inflation adjustment comes from the other two buckets. So this podcast, this episode was a little bit longer. I hope you stayed with me. Please subscribe. We'll try to explore some of these in more detail. Maybe we'll try to split this one out. But when you're thinking about having income in retirement, both having the numbers work for you and being comfortable with the strategy, having comfort with the psychology around market volatility, bond volatility, and inflation, doing something like this can be a real benefit, and it can lead to a healthier, a wealthier, and a happier retirement. Don't forget to hit subscribe. Stay well, everyone.